Shadow Foreign Secretary, hello.
Hello.
I feel like I'm giving a lift to the Newscast studio. Are you a fan of James Corden's Carpool Karaoke? Just coming to an end this week.
I do quite like James Corden, and I like. I don't. I mean, you see the clips sometimes, don't you, on Twitter? And I certainly have laughed and sort of been joyous during.
I love the Paul McCartney one where they drove around Liverpool and they went to his old house and then they surprised everyone in the pub and then everyone's crying. You're like, the power of karaoke is so good. Yeah. And then isn't the one with Lady Gaga where she's like out the window at everyone. Yeah, love it. Of course, the last one is with Adele. Is Adele a former constituent of yours?
She is. She is a proud hero of Tottenham, and she supports Spurs.
Okay.
And grew up in Tottenham, and is sort of wonderful. I love Adele.
Do you know her?
I wish I could say I know her. I really wish that.
You sort of spiritually, geographically know her.
Slightly strangely, after the awful Grenfell Tower fire, two celebrities made contact with me. One was Adele, who I think was living in Notting Hill at the time and was really concerned to do what she could. And the other was James Corden, who, I don't know how he got my number, but sent me a WhatsApp.
Right.
And bless him, wanted to send Christmas presents to the children.
Wow.
So they were both sort of in my life in that period. So yeah.
I hope you're going to text him tonight and say that you've done this tribute to Carpool Karaoke. Should we do some Adele? Should we do Rolling in the Deep? Oh, I hate singing on TV. Right, no, we have to do it. In tribute to Carpool Karaoke. So here's me and the Shadow Foreign Secretary singing Rolling in the Deep. Right.
Rolling in the deep, you had my heart inside your hands, and you played it to the deep.
Oh, that was so embarrassing. No, we can't do it again. We have to just get on with doing Newscast. I'm so embarrassed.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio now.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has survived my driving. We were stationary the whole time, just to let you know. But thanks for making it in. And Chris, you actually have had experience of driving Labour frontbenchers round in a car, haven't you?
I have, yes. So in the 2015 Labour leadership race, we decided to, at the beginning of all things carpool karaoke, rip off the idea and do something which miraculously got through BBC Health and Safety, where I drove all of the leadership candidates, bar Jeremy Corbyn, who refused, through central London whilst doing an interview.
Why
now,
did Jeremy refuse?
It's hard enough doing a political interview, and it's hard enough driving through central London. Let me exclusively reveal, doing both at the same time runs the risk of doing neither particularly well. Anyway, we did do that, and played it out on the BBC News channel and elsewhere. But yeah, Jeremy refused, and his suggestion, which we couldn't make work, unfortunately, was he didn't want to be sort of pro the car. He wanted to do it on a tandem.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the actual news that's happening in 2023, and that is this conflict between two factions in Sudan. Chris, the kind of the big UK angle has been about getting British passport holders out of the conflict.
Yeah.
What's the latest?
So the latest is, as of, what time is it now? 6:15 on Thursday evening, is that 897 people have been evacuated from Sudan by the UK on a whole series of additional flights today. They're going to carry on until the ceasefire expires, which is at midnight local time. That's 1 hour ahead of UK time this evening, tonight. Who knows then what happens after that, an extension or not, or whether flights are still feasible after a ceasefire ends, or perhaps more importantly, whether it's safe for people to get to the airport to get on a flight after the ceasefire ends. What's been intriguing has been the political debate here around the response of the UK government. So was the UK right to do what it did in terms of its focus on diplomats at the weekend, the involvement of special forces in lifting those diplomats out. The embassy was caught right between the two sides in the conflict. And then how has the UK handled the evacuation of nationals since then, both in terms of its pace and what was offered to nationals? So they were told to get to this airstrip under their own steam rather than anything else being provided to help them. Earlier on, some other countries had provided some support, picking people up at various muster points. The French had done that, albeit one of their soldiers had sustained serious injuries in the process. And broadly speaking, at least until now, and perhaps even until now, we'll see what David has to say about this, the UK domestic political debate about the UK government's handling of it has been relatively muted, as opposed to the subject of loud political disagreement.
Let's see, but first of all, let's catch up with the newscaster who was in Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, a couple of days ago. I spoke to him on BBC Sounds earlier this week. He's now out of Sudan. He's safely in Egypt, which means we can now give him his name. He's called Sam, because before we were keeping him anonymous for his own safety. And here is his account of the last bit of his journey.
The last piece of the journey involved crossing the Egyptian border at Agin. You can only imagine the chaos. Lines of cars, lines of coaches, people with handcarts containing the few precious possessions that represented everything they had left from their life in Sudan. Eventually, we got our exit stamps and our entry visas into Egypt. We were the last people on the last ferry across Lake Nasser at dusk yesterday evening, then a 3-hour taxi journey, and here we are.
So, David, what's your take on how the government's handled this? Is it understandable why maybe it took a little while to get going, or should they have been getting people out much quicker?
The backdrop to this, of course, was the botched evacuation from Afghanistan. And I'm quite sure that in the department, both ministers and officials, I would hope, have been determined to learn the lessons, and that's the judgment that I think both the media and us as the opposition have been trying to scrutinise very clearly. Look, I think that what they have said to us, and I'm subject to sort of Privy Council briefings, is clear that the embassy and FCDO staff were under some threat. It was important to get them out. It's still not clear, though, why, given that you were taking a plane of officials out, you couldn't have had some UK residents in Sudan on that plane as well, let's be clear. And it's also not clear why the French and the Germans appeared to be able to act so decisively and quickly and get some of their people and our people out sooner. Notwithstanding that, what the Select Committee was clear after Afghanistan was, look, there needs to be a strategic plan. It appears that we are seeing a plan, and no doubt about it. I suspect by midnight we'll see those numbers bump up to somewhere near 1,000 or so. There's more, we think, UK nationals, up to 4,000 in the country, but some of them will have made their own way out or have decided to stay, in fact. So I think there are still some questions about why it's been a bit slow and why other countries have acted in the way that they have. And of course, the broader issue is the ceasefire coming to an end and UK nationals still there.
Where do you draw the line on dependence of those who are British passport holders in Sudan now seeking to get out? How wide should that definition of, if you like, dependence or family be?
Well, look, I think that it's what could be about to happen in Sudan could be bloody and horrific. I'm aware of UK Sudanese nationals who've served in the NHS, been here for years, been schooled here, who will have very hard personal choices about family still left in the country. And I think that we should be a compassionate country in those circumstances, and people would expect us to be. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that you can, all the extended family can arrive.
So where's the line? Where should the line be?
Look, I think that case by case, if you're a doctor with elderly parents that you're going to leave behind with no prospect of support, we ought to be a country that's able to look compassionately on that sort of situation.
Isn't the danger of case by case, though, that it's arbitrary in the end? It's a rapid fire decision taken on an airfield. Does it not need to be defined in some way? Otherwise, you get senses of an injustice.
To be fair, Chris, sometimes it is defined. It's been defined in relation to those coming from Hong Kong. It's been defined in relation to those coming from Ukraine. The government could make the decision to do that again. So it can sometimes be defined. But I suppose I'm saying that this is a global catastrophe. It actually has big implications for the wider region, by the way, which might come home to us, because it actually means many, many more people trying to seek asylum over the coming months and years.
A few other news stories floating around. On Thursday, we heard there's going to be more train strikes in that dispute, and it's going to potentially affect people going to Eurovision. What do you think about the union's decision to strike that day?
Do you know what? I've just got back from Kenya and I hadn't heard that. I hadn't heard that. But clearly, you know, I know it causes tremendous hardship for people when, you know, and I've been caught up in strike. I've barely been able to get back home. And certainly it's caused problems campaigning and things in other parts of the country. So I know it causes tremendous hardship. I'm always hesitant to get too far into the weeds when I don't know the detail, and I don't actually. I'm not on the detail because.
But are there times because I mean, obviously the unions want there to be disruption. That's the point of a strike, so that the general public can feel the dispute and why they're fighting. But are there cases where the unions do cause too much disruption?
Part of living in a civilized democracy is and for many people struggled for this. At the turn of the last century, is the means to come together, to protest and to withdraw your labour.
You talk about the sanctity of the right to withdraw labour, but that has to be done, doesn't it, lawfully? And we see this spat involving the Royal College of Nursing and this encounter they've had with the court, courtesy of the government.
He probably doesn't know this either.
Do you know about this?
Oh, we'll fill you in. Don't worry. Well, this is breaking news. So basically, the government took the Royal College of Nurses to court because the government's argument was that their mandate for strike action runs out on the Monday of their strike next week, not on the Tuesday as they were planning. And so basically, they kind of mucked up.
Well, the court, in the end...
Should the government have taken that case though? Because the reaction from the union today is like, okay, hands up, we mucked up our dates, but actually the government are the ones that made nurses go into the dock in court and fight the legal action.
Oh, I mean, I don't know.
I know you're on the spot.
I remember when I was a lawyer, and sometimes you would take cases that are about the process instead of the substance. The substance is, come on, please get round the table and do a deal with the nurses.
But,
I mean, in the end, the public listening to this want a deal so that we're not. They're not in the end affected when when they've got cancer treatment or emergency care. So I think the substance is in the end the important thing. Roll up your sleeves and come to a deal.
But if you're a trade union, you can't schedule strike dates for a time where you haven't got a mandate for a strike, can you? I mean, that's crackers, isn't it?
Well, I don't know what's gone wrong there, but if the court's
against the RCN scheduled a strike to include a time beyond the mandate for strike action that they had.
Yes.
That's bonkers, isn't it?
Well, I'm not going to say it's bonkers because it's not my decision. I'm not in the RCN, Chris. I can see why you're leading me down that path, but I'm not going to take the bait.
I'm trying my best.
Right. Well, let's try another one. So Diane Abbott,
yes.
Her letter to the Observer at the weekend, where she basically said, "Okay, anti-Semitism's bad, but it's not as bad as racism. It's about on the level of prejudice that people get from the travelling community, or maybe even people who are redheads." And she's had the whip taken away from her, so she's now technically an independent MP. Is there a way back for Diane Abbott from this? What does she have to do?
I mean, look, the starting basis of this was the letter. It was a staggering letter.
Did you read it in the paper at the time?
I read it online. I have to say, I'll be honest, I did not recognise it as the sorts of views that I know that Diane has had historically over many years. I'm glad that she apologised pretty swiftly. I think it was right that she was suspended and there's an investigation as to what happened. I think there's some...
Why does there need to be an investigation? I mean, we know what happened. She wrote a letter and sent it to a paper and they published it.
She said it was a draft.
There's some debate about drafts and the circumstances and how, and due process. She's got to be allowed to explain that.
But what possibly
process.
could an investigation turn up that would make the case to you? Maybe there is a case, Chris, that she should be allowed back into the party, because the logic would suggest that there'd be no way back.
Chris, let me say a couple of things. I don't want to speculate that because I don't know. What I do know is that there can be no hierarchy on racism. I didn't recognise this reference to people with red hair. That was just weird and bizarre to say that, and obviously offensive. When I did my review into the criminal justice system that I was asked to do by David Cameron, I really wanted to focus on the group that's most overrepresented in the criminal justice system, which is actually Gypsy Roma Traveller. And that was sort of dismissed in the letter. So there is no hierarchy. All of that was wrong. Much of it was offensive, and I'm afraid some of it was anti-Semitic. Absolutely clear about that. That is serious. That is serious. But Diane must be allowed to explain the circumstances. And I think it's also right to say that, and I've known Diane for 25 years, we have a friendship beyond politics. I'm someone, I have friendship.
Have you spoken to her this week?
I haven't spoken to her this week.
Kenya,
I've been a little bit of WhatsApp, but I have friends who are Conservatives. I have friends who are in my party who are not completely within my my politics. Diane is a dear friend, and I'm very sad that she finds herself in this situation. However, I do want to put on record her huge contribution to fighting racism in this country, and a very important position as the first female black MP, which in the community I represent counts for a lot.
What were you saying in the WhatsApp exchanges?
I'm not going to get into that.
What's her WhatsApp picture? I'm obsessed about this. It says a lot about a person.
I'm not going to get into
Is it
that.
her, or is it like just a little icon or something? I'm just trying to...
Come on.
Let's end where we began with our tribute to carpool karaoke. Do you sing along in the car to the radio?
I do sing along in the car to the radio, actually. I used to be a cathedral chorister.
Oh, I think I knew that, actually. Pub quiz question.
Peterborough Cathedral. I was a cathedral chorister. So
are there pictures of it?
There are pictures somewhere. They've been in the papers before.
Do you have one of those little, ruffle things?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I wore a dress. I don't wear a dress now, just to say that. But
how do your passengers, whether it's family or colleagues or whoever, respond to you blasting out Cyndi Lauper, whoever it might be?
Fortunately, it's not me driving on the whole. I'm a very bad driver.
Even though it might not be fortunate for the driver.
Oh, and also, what's the Shadow Cabinet's karaoke game like?
Oh God, no! I'm not the best person to answer that because
maybe
no one's asked me to come along. I don't know. Oh God, I'm now feeling.
Oh, do you want to tell him or? No, I'm kidding.
About the Shadow Cabinet karaoke WhatsApp group?
The thing is, karaoke is overrepresented as like an activity in politics, isn't it? I think more politicians do karaoke than the average of the population.
Is it the performance gene? The politicians' performance gene.
You just can't resist a microphone.
You can't take things too seriously. I mean, it's karaoke is not so bad.
Yeah. Right, David Lammy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Chris, what will you be doing exactly a week from now? Will you be up all night doing a TV special?
I will, yeah. So I'll be sitting alongside Laura Kuenssberg and an assembled cast of people who are also pulling an all-nighter as we start to dissect the results coming in from England's local elections, or local elections in much but not all of England. No elections next week in Scotland or Wales, and there are elections in Northern Ireland coming up a few weeks later, local authority elections there too. So we'll be starting to digest what is coming in. It'll be a partial picture through the night, including once we get to dawn, and the results will trundle on through Friday as increasing interest in a certain coronation begins to gather a certain momentum. And obviously then unpacking who's going to be running or not running local authorities that they either were or weren't running the day before in parts of England. And inevitably, as will the parties, trying to work out what it means for the state of the parties a year or so ahead of a of a general election.
And the first thing you learn when you're covering sets of elections like this is about the baseline, as it's called, which is you've got to go back to the last time these seats were actually fought. That's what you're comparing. You're not comparing the last set of local elections or the last general election, though there are ways that the statos can do that, and we'll hear about that in a second. But you've got to look at where these seats were contested, or when these seats were contested last time. And we can have a little look now at the picture in England. So in 2019, when these council seats were last up for election,
Or most of them,
the Conservatives won 3,367 of them. Labour had 2,142 of them. The Lib Dems had 1,222. And the Greens had 240. But the Greens were outnumbered by independents and others. And then if you cross over to Northern Ireland from England, most of these seats there contested in 2019 as well. Biggest party in terms of the number of seats was the DUP with 122. Sinn Féin had 105 seats. The Ulster Unionists had 75. The SDLP had 59. And the Alliance Party had 53. Right, let's crunch some more numbers now, because is Professor Sir John Curtis of Strathclyde University on TV? Yes, he is. Hello, John.
Hello, Adam.
I can hear the fever in your voice about these elections.
Yes, they are an important set of elections simply because Tory MPs are going to be asking themselves, is Rishi Sunak perhaps capable of taking us to victory at the next general election? Because, of course, the opinion polls have been really, ever since the Liz Truss became Prime Minister, have been sending them a pretty desultory message. Now, the Labour lead over the Conservatives has narrowed a bit more recently, but we're still talking at a lead of 15 points or so. Well, Tory MPs will be looking for some signs that maybe things are not quite that bad. Now, you've already, however, quite crucially pointed out the importance of the baseline. And the truth is, we do, I think, need to go back and remind ourselves of politics at the baseline. We're talking about 4 years ago, but we're not talking about December 2019 when Boris Johnson won a general election. Indeed, we're not even talking about a time when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. We're going back to Theresa May. Remember her in 10 Downing Street? So we're in May 2019. Mrs. May was struggling and ultimately failing to get her Brexit deal through the House of Commons. Nigel Farage had just founded the Brexit Party, now known as Reform UK, without Mr. Farage. And it was already running at nearly 20% in the opinion polls. Or remember, Change UK, remember them? Well, they had been started just a few months earlier, and they were still running about 5% in the polls and nipping at the Liberal Democrats' heels. And meanwhile, certainly the Conservatives were in a pretty difficult situation. They were actually running at 26% in the opinion polls. That's even slightly worse than they were at the moment. But, and this is crucial, the Labour Party was also doing pretty miserably in the opinion polls, a bit better than the Conservatives, around a third of the vote. So this is a very, very different scenario from December 2019, or very different from now. But it does mean, crucially, that the Conservatives are defending a poor baseline. You already quoted the number of councillors they won. You didn't quote the number they managed to lose. They lost 1,300 seats in 2019. In terms of seats gained and lost, it was their worst result for around a quarter of a century. So Rishi Sunak's great salvation in trying to persuade his Tory MPs that maybe he can turn things around is that we're probably not looking at enormous numbers of gains and losses of either seats or of councils by the Conservatives. A few hundred, yes, but many thousands, probably not. And that's simply to do with the fact that the baseline is as bad for the Conservatives as you can imagine. That what is also, however, still true is that Labour at least are in a stronger position now than they were 4 years ago. And the other crucial question in these local elections is, will Labour at least do well enough to persuade people that maybe they might now be capable of winning a general election?
So I suppose then, you touched on a bit of this there, John, is obviously on a night like the one we're looking forward to and the day on Friday next week, there'll be no end of spin and expectation management. We're already getting that from the parties now, of course. What, in your judgment, would look like a good or bad night for the Conservatives, a good or bad night for Labour? There is the other parties as well, of course, but when we begin to think about how it might transpose across towards their prospects in a general election, what looks good or bad for those two main parties?
Well, the first thing I will say to you, Chris, is basically I would not use the measure of seats gained and lost. In the end, the measure that I will be focusing on above all, as we do every year, is a measure based on votes and not seats. And that is what we call in the BBC the projected national share. And that's basically we're collecting the detailed voting figures from nearly around 50 councils or so and using them to come up with an estimate. Well, if voters had voted in a Britain-wide election and the way they vote in these local elections, and by the way, they never do, but that's another story, how well would the parties have done? And that gives us a measure that enables us to compare local elections this year with not only 2019, but frankly, with local elections all the way back to the 1980s.
So interesting. Chris, I was going to ask you, though, one way this will be very different from 2019, the baseline, is that now you need ID to vote.
Yes.
It's going to be the first set of elections where you need to have some ID.
First set of elections in England. It's happened in Northern Ireland for a little while.
Thank you for that. See, I did so well with John with all those numbers then. I mucked up there.
So it's been recorded in Northern Ireland for the best part of 20 years. So, to turn up and vote at these elections this time, you need your passport, your driving licence, an older or disabled person's bus pass, or an Oyster 60+ card if you're in and around the London area. Not that there are elections in London itself. You can actually use out-of-date ID, provided you look the same. So, which might mean
grown a moustache, say.
Which might mean it can't be too out of date. And people have also been able to apply, if they didn't have any of those forms of ID, for what is known as a voter authority certificate, which is a legitimate piece of ID for the purpose of voting. If you don't have a passport or a driving licence or anything like that, the deadline for that has passed. The government's argument for this change is to reduce the potential for voter fraud. Critics say that voter fraud has historically been vanishingly small, and so argue that perhaps it isn't necessary and it might disenfranchise some people. But that's a definite change in terms of what you need rattling around in your purse or your wallet or your handbag or your jacket pocket in order to cast your vote.
John,
unless you go and vote by post.
Well, okay, yes. John, statistically, if the turnout by the end of this set of results is quite a lot lower than it normally is for these elections, would we be able to say, it's because of the voter ID stuff that meant people were turned away? Is that statistically possible to do?
Well, I think the answer to you, Adam, is that certainly we will be looking for patterns that might be consistent or otherwise with the claim that some voters have been disenfranchised. I mean, here essentially the argument is that, for example, it's more difficult for younger people to have the ID that's required, not least because younger people's bus passes don't count, whereas older people's bus passes in some places do, and also that people who are less well off are less likely to have a passport, they're less likely to have a driving license, etc. So I think we'll be looking for a couple of things. One is there any evidence that the turnout falls more in areas of higher deprivation? Does it fall more in places where fewer people have passports? That's one thing that we can identify from the census. Maybe also does it fall more in places with more young people? But I think I'll be honest with you, these are probably going to be no more than straws in the wind rather than definitive. But I think you can certainly anticipate if any such evidence does transpire, you can expect the critics of the move to suggest that this indeed is evidence. Now, I think the truth is the Electoral Commission itself will also be investigating this afterwards. And probably in the end, if we are wise, we will need to wait the more substantial research that they will do in the wake of these local elections.
Professor Curtis, thank you very much. See you soon.
You're welcome.
Anyway, I look forward to watching you all night in a week's time when you have, 0.01% of the results.
It is going to be fun.
This is going to be your first big
Well, exactly.
all-nighter in this political
Well,
editor.
and it's going to be a little bit kind of like Newscast, actually, because it'll be Laura sitting next to me in the big presenter's chair.
But with you having no idea what's going on.
Well,
and
that's just like Newscast.
Yeah, pretty much,
exactly.
yes. So thank you very much for listening to us, having no idea what's going on, but still chatting about it anyway. See you soon. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.